friends, Shalom. I greet all of you. I'm glad to see you all. Shalom to everyone, and I wish you all a wonderful mood. My name is Shalom Kazan. I am in Israel. This week, we've completed an entire course called Christianity in Rome. And today, we're talking about why Christians rejected paganism. The Christians we're talking about are those at the turn of the 1st to the 2nd century, the second generation of Christians. Were they Christians similar to those today? And why did later Christians incorporate paganism, while earlier Christians rejected it? They rejected paganism, but by no means did they reject the Torah. The Holy Scriptures at that time consisted only of the Tanakh, with the Torah as its foundation. Today, that's exactly what we're going to talk about. Tomorrow, on Friday, at the conclusion of our course, we will talk about the cult of saints, how the remembrance of the revered saints and the blessed martyrs gradually turned into their ultimate deification. We'll discuss this with you and wrap up the week with this fascinating topic. Next week, we're in for an even more exciting journey because we're returning to the Jewish narrative. We'll be talking with you and moving closer together toward the uprising of the diaspora. We'll be getting closer to the Bar Kokhba revolt. We'll discuss a very tragic, but very important period, a period that practically changed the Jewish world. We'll be talking about all these things throughout the next week. From time to time, I'll be switching perspectives from the course of Jewish history to the course of church history and the development of the Christian narrative. This is so that these two narratives move in parallel in your minds, and you can see in which direction they developed, how they interacted, and on the other hand, how they resisted each other. We will be studying all these questions together this year. This year promises to be very eventful, and God willing, we'll make it up to the year 325. How did everything come to be the way it is? Nothing happened suddenly, in a single moment, or in 1 second. All the processes were preceded by huge, truly massive events that are connected not only with the church. They are connected with political development, with social development, with religious development. They are, in general, connected with many things. Understanding this uneven path, will give us a picture of progress. Ultimately, my task is to show you that today we live in a completely different era, in which we are given magnificent, enormous opportunities that were not available to the first disciples, nor to the first or even the second generation. We will talk about the third generation later, as well as the fourth and the fifth. That's it. But today we live in an amazing time, an era of new opportunities and the birth of new things. It is precisely today that the Creator wants us to accomplish this greatest tikkun and return to the foundations of our faith and to the origins of our lives. Therefore, my friends, I invite all of you to our Beit Midrash channel. Please subscribe, like, hit the bell, and click the right buttons, those that will help us grow, move forward, and build our entire path ahead. Our Beit Midrash community is made up of people of different nationalities, living in various parts of the world, with different backgrounds and different experiences, including experience in Christian life. But we are all united by a single idea, to correct what was distorted and return to the house of Israel. Along the way, we work on correcting every aspect, correcting dogma, correcting theology, correcting history, and correcting our soul. This is the greatest tikkun that the Creator has entrusted us to accomplish in these times. And of course, we can only achieve this together, you and I, as one team. So, why did the first Christians reject paganism, but not the Torah? How do we know that they did not reject the Torah? Because what they rejected only proves their understanding and commitment to monotheism. And monotheism, or belief in one creator, doesn't just come out of nowhere. It isn't born simply from some intricate philosophical musings. It classically originates from the sacred writings of the Torah. The early followers of Yeshua, who lived in the heart of the Roman Empire, were, in fact, surrounded by absolute paganism. Just think about it. Temples of Jupiter, Apollo, endless rituals of sacrifice. I'll be showing you some small pictures for visualization to help you better grasp what's going on. Philip, thank you. Think about their surroundings. Temples of Jupiter, Apollo, sacrificial rituals, the cult of the emperor. It wasn't just a religion, it was the very fabric of Roman society. They decisively tore that fabric apart, often at the cost of their own lives. But at the same time, they were devoted to the Torah. What is the Torah? It is the teaching, the sacred teachings of the Jewish people. This is the very foundation on which the first disciples of Yeshua lived, Yeshua himself, the whole house of Israel before him, and on which they live to this day. They didn't say, "This is the old religion, and now we have a new religion." There was no such thing as a religion back then. The only religion they were more or less connected to was Judaism. But Judaism itself went through many changes. Because the temple was burned down, the sacrifices were stopped, and the synagogue became isolated and closed off. There were many paths that led Judaism, at that moment, into a state of isolation and a kind of survival mode. We've talked about this before, and we will continue to talk about it. They didn't say, "We have a new religion." On the contrary, they claimed that they were the true heirs, the ones fulfilling what is written in the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Their gatherings were fundamentally different from the gatherings we know today. If we had come to one of their gatherings, this is the kind of meeting we would have seen. These were, outwardly, at least, absolutely Jews. They accepted only this path. There was no other way, because basically, you could either choose this path or the pagan path. There was no other way, nothing in between, like the kind of secular middle ground that exists today. In Rome, there were no secular societies. You were either a worshipper of the emperor and a follower of Greek cults, or you were a Jew or considered yourself one. Why did they reject one ancient tradition as demonic? I mean ancient paganism, while accepting another ancient tradition as divine revelation. To understand what we're going to talk about today, to really grasp it, you need to understand the very theological, let's say, DNA of the early church. That's exactly why today we'll look at and discuss four key questions. The first question is the world of the gods. What was the paganism that they rejected like? What was it really? What is the great no? And why did they say no to this pagan world against all odds, no matter what price they had to pay? Why did they say the great yes? They said yes specifically to the Holy Scriptures. Which Holy Scriptures did they have in their hands? Which Holy Scriptures were on their lips? Which Holy Scriptures is Paul referring to when he tells Timothy, all Scripture is God-breathed? It's the Scriptures of the Tanakh, that is, the writings of the Torah, the prophets, and the Ketuvim. What is the great rethinking? Why did they understand the Torah? And why was this path so difficult and ambiguous? On the one hand, they accepted the holy scriptures of Israel, but on the other hand, the synagogue itself did not want to accept them inside because of its own complications and, as I said, the regime of absolute survival. Well then, let's take a look and dive into the very heart of early Christian identity. When we consider all these nuances, we will understand why Christianity back then is so different from what it is today. So, who were, in principle, the second generation of these people? How did they think? What perspective did they follow? We have studied the Didache together. We have looked into different perspectives together. That's it. But today, we will get closer and go even further. And where we're going is very important. So, to understand their choices, we first need to see the world through their eyes. That's why the Roman Empire of the 1st and 2nd centuries wasn't just a state in the way we imagine a state today. Rome was a spiritual supermarket, a supermarket of gods and countless deities. Rome was filled with pagans of all kinds. But there were also official state gods. There was Jupiter, there was Juno, there was Mars. There were official gods. Their cult maintained the stability and greatness of Rome itself. Taking part in these rituals was a civic duty. Like today, for example, I don't know, raising the national flag or standing up when the anthem is played. Right. At that time, if you didn't support the cult of these gods, didn't participate in the rituals, didn't offer them sacrifices, and didn't deify the emperor, then basically you weren't just a traitor. You were someone undermining the very foundations. That meant you weren't a patriot. That meant you were against it. Besides the state gods and all of that, there were also household gods, Nike Lars, Epenates. Every family had its own little altar where they made offerings to the spirits and guardians of the home. In addition to the gods of their peoples, they also had little family deities. Today, a huge number of peoples have preserved this tradition. You can find this in China, in India, and in many Eastern cults. It was also present in Rome. Religion, in principle, was a part of everyday life. It was part of food, and food was part of the gods. Clothing was also a part of these things. Exactly. Everything, everyday life, all the homes, Everything was infused with this. Then, Eastern mystical cults flourished. The cult of the Egyptian Isis, the Persian god Mithras. They offered personal salvation, secret initiations, and the promise of an afterlife. Rome had it all. But the pinnacle, or let's say the cherry on top, was the cult of the emperor. Ah, the cult of the emperor, that was the most important of all. If you were in Rome, or anywhere in the Roman Empire, it didn't matter where you lived, in which province of the empire, whether you lived in Ephesus or Corinth or anywhere else. The emperor, his cult, and his persona weren't just a matter of choice. They were a matter of your identity, your identification with the empire itself. And the choice was actually far from easy. The emperor cult was such that the emperor was considered not just the ruler, but a deity. To refuse to offer a sacrifice to the emperor's genius wasn't just a matter of having a different faith, you see? It was considered treason against the state, and treason was always punished very harshly. People were crucified precisely for disobeying the emperor. That's exactly the execution Yeshua suffered in Jerusalem. After all, he was executed on political charges and punished with a purely Roman form of execution. Crucifixion was nothing other than a political sentence. And what was his? What was his verdict? King of the Jews. In other words, the sentence for which he was crucified was that he claimed kingship. Instead of acknowledging Caesar's kingdom as the only kingdom over Judea. This, in fact, is something that many theologians today overlook or don't even consider at all. But this is actually the crux of everything. Yeshua suffered because he was the Jewish king, because he was the king of Israel from the line of David. He suffered. And that's exactly how he was, yes, that's exactly how he was identified. And this identification is extremely important because Yeshua himself, in fact, stood against the authority of Caesar, the emperor, and Rome. Yeshua himself challenged Rome, and that's why he was crucified specifically on the cross. After all, there were other forms of punishment. The Romans had other ways of executing people. The Romans would behead people. They carried out many different kinds of executions. But death on the cross was, let's say, the most brutally horrifying. And people who were enemies of the regime were punished with this particular death. This is a very important point. In other words, for any believer in Yeshua, for anyone who accepted Yeshua as the King of Israel and the King over their own life, one question arose. Yeshua challenged Rome. He did not submit to Rome. So how can I submit to it? Ultimately, this idea was completely cut out of Christian theology and wasn't even mentioned in the future. On the contrary, let every soul be subject to the authorities. Everyone must be obedient to the authorities. On the contrary, Rome later takes a leading role. We'll get to that. And when Rome took the leading position and stopped being a place of resistance and disobedience for Christians, Christianity itself changed at its core. So, the cherry on top, as I said, is the cult of the emperor. So, polytheism, my friends, is the belief in many gods, a multitude of deities. So, what actually united all these cults? In polytheism, you can worship many gods. You can worship Jupiter, Isis. You can worship your household spirit, your seraphim, all at the same time. Gods were depicted, sculpted, painted. Statues were built for them, in front of which all sorts of rituals were performed. Gods were carried around, moved from place to place, and temples were built for them. And always, whenever Rome conquered other peoples, it would also subjugate their gods. And if those people refused, the Romans would simply destroy their shrines and build their own temples in their place. Relationships with the gods were built on the principle of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. I offer you a sacrifice, I pray to you, I try to appease you or do something for you, and in return you give me a good harvest, or victory in court, or victory in war, or some other blessings. In other words, all relationships with the gods were based on a very simple principle. You do something for me, I do something for you. Basically, not much has changed today. For many people, faith in God is simply a search for blessings. It's a search for solutions, a search for healing, a search for answers to their problems, and a search for what I can give to God in order to get more in return. I've said many times that this is ritual paganism. Essentially, this is pagan thinking when we think in these terms. Yeshua condemned this when he spoke about prayer. He said, "Do not be like the pagans, who think they will be heard because of their many words." In other words, they were looking for ways to appease God, ways to turn God's attention to themselves, and basically, ways to receive blessings. It's exactly in these terms that, generally speaking, believers think today. They aren't taught other ways of thinking. They're taught how to get a blessing, how to get healed, how to achieve success, how to get this, how to get that, how to pray correctly, how to fast correctly, how to do this, that, and the other thing properly. All, our entire way of thinking is built on the principle of transactionality. In other words, you do something for me, and I do something for you. This is pure paganism. Even if you use the name of Jesus and even if you read the Bible. And being a pagan doesn't mean worshiping a stone or a tree. It doesn't mean you'll only follow after some images. Paganism is, in general, a way of thinking. Basically, it's the quality of the ideology with which a person approaches their God. In order to truly change the course of these pervasive thoughts, you absolutely have to climb out of paganism. There is simply no other conceivable way. So, religion was inseparable from public life. That doesn't mean there was some kind of secular life. No, there was no such thing. Festivals, processions, games, meetings of craft guilds, everything began with rituals in honor of some god. And then, into this world comes a small group of people. Mostly they were Jews, and later converts from paganism, who said to all of this, "No, we can't do this, and we won't do this." So, what were the reasons for breaking away from paganism? After all, it's important to understand these reasons. It's important to study them. Why could a person, surrounded by paganism, nevertheless say no to it? Rejecting paganism was not just about swapping one set of rituals for another. It doesn't mean, well, Now we're all Christians. We have our own holidays. No, my friends, this was a fundamental worldview break. It wasn't just about changing one set of holidays for another. This break had several very deep reasons, rooted in the Jewish heritage of faith. And the first reason above all is radical monotheism. At the heart of Israel's faith lies a cry: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. One, not just the chief among gods, not just one of many, but the one and only creator of all that exists. This idea, this very idea, cannot just arise on its own. It can't simply be arrived at through ideological or philosophical reflection. For a person raised on this very idea, and who were the people raised on this idea? They were the Jews. The very thought of worshiping Jupiter, or a statue of the emperor, or a river spirit was not just a mistake, not just wrong. It was an abomination, and it was a betrayal. In their understanding, you can't serve two masters. Where did they get this understanding from? Where did it come from? Where did this understanding originate? If, according to the Church Fathers, Jesus abolished, and Paul confirmed the abolition of the Torah, and now everything is by grace. If everything is by grace, then what's the problem? What's the problem with living happily and joyfully? Why was it necessary to die, to go to one's death, to face terrible executions? So, where do we encounter the prohibition against idolatry? Of course, we find it in the Torah. We find the second commandment of the Decalogue among the 10 Commandments. Do not make for yourself an idol or any image. Do not bow down to them or serve them. In other words, for early Christians, just like for Jews, God was transcendent. He could not be depicted, he could not be drawn, and you couldn't make an icon of him. And any statue was considered an idol and a lifeless piece of stone or wood. And worshipping any statue or any stone was an insult to the living God and was considered blasphemy, which was regarded as a terrible sin. Of course, this created huge social problems. A believer couldn't go to a public celebration. Like today, for example, everyone goes to Christmas, but those who believe in Hanukkah don't go to Christmas. This creates social problems. So how do you get along in society now? How do you get along now in society? Now, in modern Christianity, there are no problems. They say, come on, we don't worship Christmas trees. We just, it's all just simple for us. My friends, if the first Christians had thought that way, they would have blended in with paganism much earlier. But it's thanks to them that we have something genuine, something that existed in the first and second centuries. There was a huge social problem. A believer couldn't go to a festival, couldn't take part in a guild feast, because everything was connected to food sacrificed to idols. These were the very questions that people actually asked the Apostle Paul. We see in Corinth a huge number of these questions, where Paul says, I don't want you to have fellowship with demons or to take part in this food. And in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 15, it is written that they should avoid anything sacrificed to idols. In other words, a complete refusal to participate in these events. And this is a huge social problem. A person can't go anywhere. He can't be invited to a birthday party, or rather, he can be invited, but he simply can't go because even at a birthday party there's some kind of worship and thanksgiving to the family gods. It's a huge problem. All right, the Jews lived their own lives. They had their own neighborhoods, their own towns. They were separated and lived their own way, and, generally speaking, people didn't bother them. But Christians, they didn't have their own towns or even their own markets, which created a huge problem for their very existence and integration. And was it even integration as such? Then there's the ethical chasm. The ethical gap was enormous. The Torah and the prophets called for holiness, justice, and mercy. Be holy because I am holy. The Torah makes this absolutely clear. But what did believers see in the pagan world? What kind of holiness? They saw temple prostitution, they saw religious orgies, they saw the cruelty of gladiatorial games, where killing was pure entertainment. There was the practice of abandoning unwanted newborns. There was an enormous gulf between the ethics of the Torah and the morality of pagan Rome. They couldn't worship gods whose myths were full of deceit, adultery, and violence. If you study the stories, the myths about the Greek gods, oh, let me tell you, you'll learn a lot. You'll see a lot of interesting things. How these gods lived, how they quarreled, how they mated, what kind of children they had. All these things were completely incompatible with the Torah and the prophets because the first Christians lived precisely according to these scriptures. There was no New Testament canon, and there were no New Testament writings either. There were some letters circulating, letters from the apostles, letters, but again, this wasn't a canon. None of this was considered sacred scripture. These were letters with recommendations. But where is the foundation? Where do you get the foundation from? What do you base things on? Where is the very basis itself? Where is that thing you can hold on to, that you can call the foundation of our lives? Where did they look first and foremost? Where did they draw this ethics from? The ethical gap between the Torah and Rome was enormous. In fact, that gap is still enormous today. If you take the ethics of the Torah and even of modern Christianity, the gap is enormous. We see millions of people who worship statues, paint icons, offer sacrifices to images, venerate saints as gods, and pray to the Mother, the Pope, the Mother. Today, we have reached such a level that a Jew simply cannot come close to this in any way, even if he really wanted to. Why? Because the ethical standard of holiness is deeply embedded in the Torah itself. The fourth reason for this red line, the reason why the first Christians were essentially different, is this red line. It was the refusal to worship the emperor. For a Roman, tossing a pinch of incense onto the altar before the statue of the emperor was simply a gesture of loyalty. There was absolutely no problem with it. But for a Christian, this was an act of worshiping a human as God. Worshipping a human as God was a direct violation of the first commandment. For those Christians, the ideas of the Trinity and various other Trinitarian concepts, which would later become easily and seamlessly integrated into the foundations of Christianity, were unacceptable to the earliest Christians. It was precisely this refusal that became the main reason for the persecutions under emperors like Nero and Domitian. They were not killed for believing in Yeshua. No, no, no. Believe whatever you want, it's your business. There's no telling who else you might want to believe in. That's not why they were persecuted or killed. So, what were they killed for? For refusing to believe in the divinity of the Caesar. They were martyrs for monotheism. And all martyrs for monotheism are considered saints. The sages of Israel once said in the Talmud that anyone who rejects idolatry becomes a Jew just like Abraham, who turned away from polytheism and became a Jew, a person who came to believe in the one Creator. So, why did the Torah remain the foundation? We need to understand this. With paganism, everything is clear. We'll talk about it. It's endless. But why didn't they reject the Torah as well? After all, if this is the Old Testament and all of it is old, then the Torah is no longer needed. Why didn't they say, for example, that everything before Yeshua is outdated, obsolete? The answer is very simple, my friends. If they had said that, it would have meant destroying the very foundation on which their faith was built. Their perception of Yeshua was that of a righteous Jew who lived a holy and righteous life, and suffered precisely for that, for challenging Caesar himself. He suffered on the cross with the sign reading, King of the Jews. So, Yeshua and the apostles were Jews. They were not Greeks. They were Jews. Their native language was Hebrew. They spoke Aramaic, and their holy scripture was the Tanakh. When Yeshua argued with the Pharisees, he always quoted the Torah, never any Greek philosophers. When the apostles preached, they always supported their words by referring to the prophets and the Torah. To reject the Torah and to reject the Tanakh would be to call Yeshua and the apostles absolute liars. So when we say today that this is the Old Testament and we don't need any of it, and that none of it has anything to do with us now that we live by grace, we are basically making Yeshua out to be a liar. And the apostles, who referred to the Torah to prove everything they believed in, we consider them to be uneducated liars. How is it that they based their lives on the Torah and the commandments, while we, on the other hand, are trying to get rid of all that? But what is the essence of the Torah? Because the Torah is the revelation of the one true God, that is its essence. That is what it's all about. The issue isn't about the ceremonial commandments of Kashrut or Shabbat or any other things. These aren't even just ceremonies, they're commandments for life. But that's not the essence of the Torah. The essence of the Torah is that the Creator is one, and His name is one. That is, for the believers in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and also the Father of the Lord Yeshua, it's the same God. There are no other gods. There isn't some God who was God over Yeshua, and some other God who was the God of the Jews. It's one and the same God. The scriptures of Israel, the scriptures of the Tanakh, and the commandments of the Creator, these are His word. This is the story of His relationship with mankind. They did not see themselves as creators of a new religion. Such thoughts never even crossed their minds. Not in any way. They saw themselves as a branch grafted onto the olive tree of Israel. Paul taught about this. The apostles taught about this. People taught about this. They lived in this spirit. And that's exactly why they were who they were. And that's exactly what was forgotten already by the third and fourth generations. The entire main argument of the early church was based on this, that the life, death, and resurrection of Yeshua were foretold in the Tanakh. They didn't make this up. They didn't say, we invented this, or that some people came up with it for us. If we regard the Tanakh as Holy Scripture, then everything we believe about the Messiah is ultimately foretold in the Tanakh. It was there that they found proof of their Messiahship. It was there that they established their ethical standards. There was no Passover yet, and there were no Christian holidays, no Christmas, no Pentecost. These holidays simply did not exist. So, what holidays were there? There were the holidays of the Torah. There was Pesach, there was Shavuot, there was Sukkot, there was Shabbat. In other words, without the Torah and the prophets, they had no evidence at all. And they didn't even have any arguments. What if today you didn't have the Torah, didn't have the Tanakh, didn't have anything at all? How would you be able to believe? What would you base your arguments on? How would you be able to build your own path for yourself? After all, you need a canon, you need a foundation, you need a base from which you must push off. That's why the Torah is a moral and ethical standard. The Ten Commandments calls for justice, love for your neighbor, care for the widow and the orphan. This was essentially perceived as an eternal, unchanging divine revelation about what is good and what is evil. And this is the very foundation of the Torah. But if they accepted the Torah, if they did accept it, then why didn't they follow, for example, all its commandments? They didn't observe all the commandments just like the Jews in the synagogue did. For a very simple reason, the Jews in the synagogue distanced themselves from them. That's why they took only the most basic, fundamental requirements for themselves. But history shows us that the Nazarenes, the Ebionites, and other groups who would later be labeled as heretics and so on, did observe the commandments, circumcised their children, and kept kosher. There was no longer a temple, so no one could offer sacrifices. Nevertheless, all of this was still present, and the first early believers lived by this. But because they lived in those times, and we live today in a different era, we are called to restore what was lost. That is what we are doing today. In other words, the early believers didn't just read the Torah. They reinterpreted it at its core in the light of the Messiah. They saw in the Messiah a reinterpretation of many things. A reinterpretation. So, what did they see? What are, for example, three important qualities? The first is the moral law, the ethical commandments. The Ten Commandments, including Shabbat, which is the fourth commandment, they considered these commandments to be eternal and universal. History shows us that only in Antioch and Alexandria did they not celebrate Shabbat, but celebrated Sunday instead. I mean, in the following centuries, in many other cities, Christians continued to observe Shabbat. This is very important. It's something that would eventually be uprooted from them completely. So, the moral law. It remained, it is universal. It reflects the very character of God Himself. Yeshua, God forbid, could never have abolished it. He only deepened it, expanded it, and revealed its profound meaning. Everything Yeshua said in the Gospels, if we read carefully, was precisely about morality and ethics, what is called musar. Second are the civil and judicial laws of the Torah. These laws regulated the life of Israel. Israel was a theocratic state in those distant times when it still had some form of statehood. These laws were considered to be given for a specific people and a specific time and were regarded as obligatory for believers who lived in those days. But people living in other countries could not exist according to the civil and judicial laws of the Torah, because to do so would require establishing judicial bodies similar to the Sanhedrin that existed in Israel. Christians could not allow themselves to do this, and they did not create such institutions, because by that time most people were no longer Jews. The ceremonial law. This includes laws about sacrifices, laws about the priesthood, laws about temple rituals, laws about the rules of ritual impurity, and various other laws that, in essence, were already impossible to fulfill because there was no temple. And even if they could be fulfilled, they were only connected to the Jewish way of life, which the first Christians no longer had access to. These are interesting things, very interesting things. The Messiah is the Lamb of God who, as a sacrifice, in the image of a lamb and in the image of a sacrifice, dies on the cross for humanity, just like the sacrifice that was offered in the temple. The high priest who performed all these sacrifices, Yeshua, becomes this high priest. This is symbolic. Yeshua was not a high priest in terms of the priesthood itself, but these images are shown to us. The same goes for the temple. Now, the person himself becomes the temple. Basically, in Judaism, there are the same concepts, the same ideas. They understood this from the perspective of the Messiah. Jews will understand this from the perspective of prayers and various other descriptions. Now, our task is to try to understand both sides, to grasp how they thought and lived. Because today, we are called to restore precisely that way of life. Can we, in the 21st century, restore that path that once was? Of course. We not only can do it, we are obligated to do it. And here, of course, as we come to the end of our study, we need to make an important clarification. This process of rethinking was neither instantaneous nor unanimous. It wasn't as if someone just made a decision. In the first century and even later, as I mentioned, there were large groups of Yeshua's followers for whom the question was posed a bit differently. The Christian path itself was not uniform. They didn't have a center, like Jerusalem was for the first generation. For example, by the second generation, there was no longer a center. These groups were scattered in different places. In Ethiopia, there was its own form of Christianity, which was fundamentally different from Greek Christianity. We have already studied who the Nazarenes and the Ebionites were. Yulia, thank you. We have already talked about how these were Jewish communities who observed Shabbat, lived as Jews, kept kosher, circumcised their sons, and attended synagogue. They didn't see any contradiction at all. For them, faith in Yeshua was an inseparable part of Judaism itself. They were Jews, essentially. But as Gentiles began joining these communities, which was already happening in the times of John, Paul, and Peter, even back then, as Gentiles became bishops, priests, and pastors, they began to free their congregants from the need to follow the laws and commandments of the Torah. So, what was the conflict? Their position essentially conflicted with the growing majority of Gentile believers, for whom all these Torah prescriptions, and the Jews themselves, will look at why they distanced themselves from the Jews. There is a historical logic, historical truth to this. It's very important to understand what was happening to them. After all, we don't really, truly understand this. Why did they distance themselves from the Jews? Because at that time, being a Jew was very dangerous, whether you were a supporter of the Jews, friends with Jews, or supported them in any way. We'll look at this through a European lens, through the European context, through the revolt of the diaspora and the Bar Kokhba revolt. We'll look at why being a Jew was dangerous in those times at all, and how Jews were generally perceived. That's why pagans who joined these communities would reshape them to fit their own ways. The opposition from the Nazarenes and everyone who tried to preserve the old path made these communities increasingly marginal. Over time, what had been the norm for the first disciples, observing the Torah, came to be seen by the majority as a Judaizing heresy. Thus, the general direction was already set towards separating the new path. That's why, alongside Paul's communities made up of Gentiles, there continued to exist Jewish communities for whom loyalty to Yeshua and loyalty to the Torah were inseparable. And that's why we have the Antiochian and Alexandrian paths. And ultimately, these two paths will lead us to the Council of Nicaea. And we'll see which orthodoxy Rome will ultimately adopt. This is very important, my friends, in order to understand everything we've been studying together. So, let's sum up what we've talked about today. The identity of early Christianity was forged in a complex double movement. On the one hand, they said no to the radical pagan world with its polytheism, idols, and a morality they considered corrupt, and for this, they suffered. On the other hand, they said yes to the sacred scriptures of Israel. They saw themselves as grafted onto this vine, and this is where the church should arrive today. They did not reject the Torah as the church does today. For them, the Torah was the foundation of their faith, the source of their knowledge about the one God, a collection of prophecies. From there, they drew wisdom and knowledge. But this, yes, was not simple. It was not entirely straightforward. And it led them to a great rethinking. In other words, for the growing Gentile church, the Torah was divided into the eternal moral law and the ceremonial laws. So they decided for themselves that they would ultimately keep the moral laws, but the ceremonial ones, such as the Sabbath and various other things, they would not observe. But in the future, they not only abandoned these practices, they redirected them entirely in a different direction, which resulted in a profound distortion of the whole path. About these and other paths, and about why the Church increasingly separated itself from its Jewish roots, and whether there was ever a chance for some kind of unity, all these questions we will leave for future discussions. The only thing we need to understand is that this was a complicated, painful process, defining the Christian path for future generations. Many were labeled as heretics and Judaizers, expelled from their cities and communities, rejected by their families, and lived as outcasts on their journey. And many were even forgotten along this path. But nevertheless, history tells us that there were always branches, always groups, and always people within Christianity who still kept the Torah and saw their path as the path of the first apostles. And we, as people who have come into this era and this world today, as people who are returning to where it all began, since sooner or later everything comes full circle for us, it is extremely important to study all this history in order to understand where we should return to today. And is there a path for us in these times? Should we remain with endless paganism, or is there the path that Yeshua and the apostles began? And if we do not return to this path and do not understand how to exist within it, then of course we will never be able to correct that great distortion and deception. As for me, I bless you, my friends, and wish you a wonderful Shabbat. May the Almighty bless.